The chandelier glowed above the long dining table, its light bouncing off silverware and crystal as laughter filled the Bennett estate. Everyone looked perfect, hair-polished smiles rehearsed. I was about to lift my glass when my sister Caroline rose from her seat, her red dress catching the light like a warning flare. "Let's make this Christmas memorable," she said, voice bright and clear. "As of today, I'm officially taking over Bennett Interiors. And Amelia, you're fired." A beat of silence. Then came the applause. My father nodded approvingly, proud as ever of his eldest daughter's leadership. The others joined in clapping as if this were some grand achievement. I simply took a slow sip of wine, let the Cabernet roll across my tongue, and smiled. "Congratulations," I said softly. "But before you celebrate, you might want to check the company emails." Caroline froze. Her hand hovered over her phone, confusion flickering in her eyes. Then she unlocked it, scrolled, and I watched the color drain from her face. The room fell quiet, tension crackling between the candle flames. No one else understood what was happening, but I did. This was the moment everything changed, the moment truth came to dinner. They say betrayal tastes bitter. To me it tasted like fine wine. Sitting there in my own home, surrounded by people who wore loyalty like jewelry, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. For the first time, I wasn't the one being dismissed, ignored, or outmaneuvered. I had been waiting for this night. But before that, I need to tell you how we got here, how a family built on legacy and lies finally ate itself alive. 5 years earlier, the Bennetts looked perfect on paper. Our mother, Margaret Bennett, had founded Bennett Interiors with nothing but a sewing machine and a dream. Her designs were timeless, rich oak textures, handcrafted cabinets, the kind of furniture that made homes feel like they had stories. She built the business with integrity. And when success came, so did pride. But pride has a way of mutating into poison. My father, Richard Bennett, had always been the face of order and control. Sharp suits, sharper opinions. To him, family dinners were board meetings, and love was performance-based. Caroline, the eldest, inherited his confidence and his hunger for dominance. She handled public relations, flashing her charm in glossy magazines, her smile worth more to him than any quarterly report. I was the quiet one, the numbers girl, the one who asked questions that made everyone uncomfortable. After graduating from Columbia with a finance degree, I joined the company as CFO, determined to protect what my mother had built. But Caroline's charisma always won the room. My father would say, "You could learn something from your sister Amelia. She understands people." He never saw that what she really understood was manipulation. When Mom was still alive, she balanced us. Her warmth softened his edges, her grace diffused Caroline's arrogance. But after her sudden passing, everything shifted. Dad became colder, more dependent on Caroline's flattery. My warnings about irregular financial reports were brushed aside as paranoia. Caroline knew how to twist the truth until it sparkled. She threw charity galas with company funds, called it brand visibility. She hired influencers for strategic partnerships, which conveniently doubled as personal friends. Whenever I questioned expenses, she smiled sweetly. "Don't worry, little sister. Some of us think bigger." The first real crack appeared during a board meeting 2 years ago. I presented an audit that showed discrepancies in our vendor accounts. Caroline laughed it off, claiming the figures were outdated. Dad sided with her without even glancing at the numbers. "We trust Caroline's strategy," he said. "You're too rigid, Amelia. Try to see the bigger picture." I did see it. I just wish they had too, the picture of our family sliding quietly into corruption. After that meeting, I stopped arguing. I learned to listen, to wait. The louder Caroline got, the more mistakes she made. She began signing contracts without approval, moving funds between accounts that didn't match project codes. Each time I documented everything. It was like watching termites crawl through the beams of a house everyone thought was solid. By last spring, I knew something was deeply wrong. Reports vanished from the server. My access passwords were suddenly reset by admin. When I confronted IT, they said the order came from Caroline herself. That night, I stayed in my office, long after everyone left, scrolling through archived invoices. At 2 in the morning, I found a transaction, $200,000 wired to a shell company registered under Design Partners LLC. The director's name, Caroline Bennett. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it over the hum of the fluorescent lights. I printed everything, locked the copies in a safe, and stared out the window at the city below. Rain streaked across the glass like fingerprints. That was the night I stopped being afraid of losing the company. I was afraid of what it had already become. Still, I kept my silence. I wanted to believe Dad would eventually see reason, that truth would win without bloodshed. But Caroline was always 3 steps ahead. She started whispering to him that I was burned out, that maybe I needed a break. Soon my workload was quietly reduced, my decisions overruled. A new consultant joined the finance team, someone she'd personally hired. I recognized the move for what it was: slow erasure. Then came November. I walked into my office one morning and found my name missing from the executive directory. My ID card didn't work. I had been effectively fired without notice. My father wasn't even in the building when it happened. Caroline told me with a smirk, "Dad thinks you should take some time for yourself. Family first, remember." That night I drove to Mom's old studio, the one still filled with her sketches and the scent of varnished wood. I sat there for hours, staring at her unfinished blueprints, feeling the silence press in. Somewhere inside, beneath grief and fury, something shifted. I wasn't going to beg for a seat at their table anymore. I would build my own, and when the time came, I'd make them choke on the truth. A week later, I began collecting every trace of evidence I could find: emails, invoices, old backups. The digital footprints of Caroline's empire of lies. It was slow, tedious work, but each piece brought me closer to something's solid proof. And so, on that bright December night, when Caroline raised her glass and declared my termination in front of the family, I didn't flinch. I'd spent too many years preparing for this scene. She thought she was delivering the final blow, but she had no idea that the stage had been set long before she spoke. Now, as she stood there, frozen, staring at her phone, I leaned back in my chair and smiled faintly. Around us, the glow of the candles seemed sharper, the silence heavier. My father looked from her to me, confusion knitting his brow. "Caroline?" he asked. But she couldn't answer. Her mouth opened slightly, her eyes wide, as she scrolled faster, the color gone from her face. I set down my glass, folded my napkin, and looked at my family, the same people who had once dismissed me, doubted me, replaced me. "Merry Christmas," I said quietly. "You might want to finish reading those emails." Because the truth at last had RSVP'd to dinner. The family portrait hung above the fireplace, frozen in time. 4 smiling faces framed in gold: Dad, Mom, Caroline, and me. Every Christmas someone dusted it, polished the glass, and made sure the illusion stayed perfect. But illusions crack. Ours started splintering the day Mom died. We looked like the perfect family, the ones who built something from nothing. Bennett Interiors had been Mom's dream long before it was a business. She started in the garage, sanding wood by hand, cutting fabric until her palms bled. I grew up falling asleep to the smell of pine and varnished the sound of her sewing machine humming late into the night. By the time Caroline and I were in college, Bennett Interiors had become a name people respected. Our furniture was featured in design magazines, our pieces used in celebrity homes. Success turned the garage into a showroom and our mother into a legend. But fame also brought division. Caroline loved the attention. Cameras adored her, clients called her the face of Bennett. She smiled like she'd been born for the spotlight, never missing a photo op. I preferred spreadsheets and balance sheets, the invisible backbone that kept the company running. Mom used to say we were 2 halves of her heart. Caroline was the color, I was the structure. Dad liked Caroline's half better. When Mom was alive, she smoothed things over. She had that gift soft words that tamed egos and diffused anger before it erupted. Your father means well, she'd whisper when he dismissed my ideas. He just trusts what he can see. I wanted to believe her. But Dad only saw results, never the process. When Caroline launched a glamorous showroom in Seattle, he called her a visionary. When I reduced costs and balanced the budget that saved the company thousands, he said I was doing my job. I used to sit in meetings watching Caroline talk over me, with a voice dipped in honey. Amelia worries too much, she'd say, tapping her manicured nail against the table. She's brilliant, but she lacks imagination. Dad would nod proud that his eldest daughter spoke like an executive. I'd smile tightly and swallow the words I wanted to say because in our family truth was less valuable than charm. Mom was the only one who noticed the imbalance. One night when I was 25, she invited me to the old workshop. She was carving a table leg by hand, wood shavings curling at her feet. "You're strong, Amelia," she said without looking up. "But strength isn't loud, it's patient. And patience doesn't mean silence." I didn't understand her then. I do now. She taught me that integrity mattered more than applause. When everything feels unfair, she said, don't fight for attention. Fight for what's right. It was her way of telling me she saw the favoritism, even if she couldn't change it. When she died, that balance went with her. Mom's funeral was a media event. Caroline wore a black designer dress, wiped her tears with grace, and thanked guests for their condolences. I barely made it through my eulogy. Dad kept busy shaking hands, already talking about continuing her legacy. I just stood there staring at the mahogany casket, the same kind of wood Mom used for her first line of cabinets, and wondered if legacy was just another word for control. After the funeral, Dad threw himself into work. He filled the house with meetings, investors, deadlines. Caroline took charge of modernizing the company, rebranding it for a younger market. She replaced artisans with influencers, craftsmanship with clickbait. I tried to remind her that Bennett Interiors stood for authenticity, that Mom's designs were about feeling, not fame. Caroline laughed. "Don't be dramatic, Amelia. We're evolving," Dad agreed. "Your sister's right," he said one night over dinner. "The market's changing. It's time we think bigger." He didn't look at me when he said it. He rarely did. From that point on, every conversation felt like a test. I was destined to fail. Caroline's words carried weight, mine carried resistance. At meetings, she'd drop names of celebrities she'd networked with, projects she'd secured. I'd point out budget holes, unexplained expenses, and inconsistent data. Her smile never faltered. "Numbers don't tell the whole story, sis," she'd say. "You can't measure influence, but numbers don't lie, people do." A year after Mom's death, the company began expanding too fast. New offices, new suppliers, new consultants. I noticed invoices from firms I didn't recognize, contracts signed with barely any oversight. When I brought them to Dad, he sighed. "You need to trust your sister. She's keeping us relevant." "Relevant?" I asked. "Or reckless?" He set his glass down hard enough to make the ice clink. "Don't start, Amelia. Not tonight." It was Christmas Eve, our first one without Mom. The house felt hollow, like the walls were listening. Caroline had organized everything, the decor, the catering, the guests. All I had to do was show up. I spent the evening smiling politely, watching Caroline hold court like a queen, her laughter echoing through the room. When it was time for the family toast, she spoke about the bright future of Bennett Interiors and how our mother's vision lives on. Everyone applauded. I stood there, glass in hand, unable to find words. That was the moment I realized what we'd become, a company wearing my mother's name, but none of her values. The months that followed only confirmed it. Caroline grew bolder, more controlling. She started making decisions without consulting the board. When I questioned her, she'd send emails CCing Dad, subtly implying I was struggling with the stress. She called it protecting the family dynamic. I called it manipulation. At home, Dad pretended everything was fine. He avoided conflict like it was bad for business. When I told him the company was being mismanaged, he said, You worry too much. Caroline has vision. Vision without ethics is vanity, I snapped once. He looked at me like I'd just insulted the family name. Don't speak like that in this house. That house. The mansion Mom had designed herself, the one filled with handcrafted wood and sunlight, had become a museum of hypocrisy. Every hallway whispered her absence. Every Christmas ornament Caroline bought glittered like guilt. I started staying late at the office, working after everyone left. That's when I began noticing the small things: files renamed, folders moved, passwords changed. Caroline was locking me out. Slowly, quietly, efficiently. One night, after another fruitless meeting with Dad, I sat alone in my office, staring at the company's mission statement etched on the wall: integrity through design. Mom's words. They no longer fit the room. A part of me wanted to quit, to let them have their empire of deceit. But then I remembered Mom's workshop, her calloused hands, her voice, saying, "Fight for what's right." So I fought in silence. I copied financial reports, backed up files, tracked patterns. The numbers told a story of excess greed and deception. It wasn't until late one Friday that I found something impossible to ignore: a draft titled Leadership Transition Plan, PDF. It had Caroline's name all over it, her plans to restructure the leadership hierarchy for efficiency. My name was at the bottom next to the words position redundancy, transition to external consultant. I stared at the screen, my pulse loud in my ears. It wasn't just a plan, it was an execution. That was when I knew the perfect family portrait had already shattered. The cracks weren't visible yet, but they were spreading fast. I printed the document, slipped it into my briefcase, and walked out of the building. The parking lot was empty, the city quiet under falling snow. Inside my car, I sat for a long time, watching my breath fog the glass. In that silence, something hardened inside me. Not anger, not grief, but resolve. I wasn't going to let them erase me. Not from the company, not from my mother's legacy, and not from the truth. ChatGPT denoy. The PDF was still open on my screen when the office lights flickered off automatically at midnight. My name sat there in cold black text next to the words redundant position. My father's signature, his real signature, sat below the approval line. It wasn't even dated, just there like a quiet execution waiting to be carried out. I remember staring at that signature until the letters blurred. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that maybe Caroline had typed it in herself as a draft, that Dad hadn't really signed it. But the truth had a smell, sharp and metallic, and I'd learned to recognize it. This was deliberate. I printed a copy, folded it into a folder, and slid it into my bag. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the heating vent and the echo of my heartbeat in my ears. The next morning I went straight to Dad's office before he could leave for a meeting. His assistant tried to stop me, but I pushed past her. He was standing behind his desk reading the newspaper, coffee steaming beside him. "Amelia," he said without looking up, "this is unprofessional." "I need to know if you sign this," I said, holding the document out. He looked at it for half a second, then sighed. Caroline explained everything. "It's just part of the restructuring." "Restructuring?" I repeated. "Dad, this removes me entirely from the company." He set the paper down like it was something trivial. "You've been under a lot of stress lately. Caroline thought you might appreciate a break. The board agrees it's for the best." "You didn't even read it," I said, voice trembling. "I don't need to," he replied, his tone final. "I trust Caroline." The words hit harder than any slap. I just stood there, folder in hand, while he walked past me, grabbing his coat. "Try to enjoy the holidays," he said before leaving the room. I stood in the silence he left behind, the smell of his cologne lingering like old smoke. That was the moment I stopped hoping for his approval. Later that day, I checked the office database again, looking for the file. It was gone. Deleted. Every trace of the PDF erased from the shared system. Only the copy I'd printed remained. The following week, I started noticing more irregularities, numbers that didn't match between monthly reports and vendor invoices, payments routed to accounts I didn't recognize. One name kept appearing: Design Partners LLC. I'd seen it before. The transactions were disguised as consulting fees, but the amounts were too high, the timing too frequent. At first, I thought it might be a coincidence, until I dug into the registration data and saw Caroline's name listed as the founder. My breath caught. It was right there, hidden in plain sight. She wasn't just mismanaging money, she was stealing it. That night, I stayed late, gathering copies of invoices, transfers, contracts. I printed them one by one, labeling each with dates and notes. I didn't even hear Uncle Henry walk in until he said my name. Amelia. His voice was soft, cautious. "You're still here," I turned. He stood in the doorway, scarf still around his neck, holding a paper bag that smelled like Chinese takeout. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "Maybe I have," I replied, showing him one of the reports. He frowned, scanning it. "This is serious. I know." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. "Your mother used to stay late like this. Always thought something felt off and wouldn't rest until she found the reason." "She found it, didn't she?" I asked. Henry gave a small, knowing smile. "She always did. She just didn't always like the answers." We ate quietly for a while, the smell of lo mein filling the air. Before he left, he rested a hand on my shoulder. "Be careful," he said. "Your sister may play dirty, but she's still family." I waited until he was gone, then whispered to the empty room, "Not anymore." The next morning, Caroline appeared in my office. Her heels clicked across the marble floor, echoing like a countdown. She closed the door behind her. "You've been digging," she said lightly, as if commenting on the weather. "I'm just doing my job," I replied, minimizing the window on my screen. She smiled, all teeth. "Dad doesn't like paranoia. It makes you look unstable." "I'm not paranoid," I said. "I'm aware." She leaned forward, resting her hands on my desk. "Stay in your lane, Amelia. We both know this company runs better when you handle the numbers and I handle everything else." "You mean the image?" I said. "And the money that comes with it." Her eyes flashed. "Careful," she whispered. "Accusations without proof are dangerous." I met her gaze without flinching. "Then I guess you should stop giving me proof." For a second, her face hardened. Then she smiled again, too sweetly. "Merry Christmas, little sister. Try not to ruin the family spirit." She left without another word, perfume hanging in the air, long after the door clicked shut. I sat there for a long time, staring at my reflection in the dark computer screen. Her words weren't just a warning, they were a threat. That evening, I gathered every piece of evidence I had and stored it on an encrypted drive. I hid the folder under a neutral label, Financial Forecast 2023, and locked it in my desk. I thought I was being careful. I wasn't careful enough. 2 days later, my access to the company's financial system was restricted. My email password stopped working. It said it was routine maintenance. When I went to the finance floor, my nameplate had been removed. Caroline's efficiency was terrifying. I left work early, the winter air biting my face, as I walked through downtown Portland. The Christmas decorations glittered in shop windows, families, laughing lights, twinkling everything, pretending to be happy. I ducked into a cafe to warm up and clear my head. As I stirred my coffee, I felt my phone buzz. A new message. No sender ID. Just 6 words. "Stop before you regret it." I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me. No one was. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Caroline had eyes everywhere. That night, I called Uncle Henry. "She's closing in," I said. "I'm losing access to everything." He sighed. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago. What your mother left me, something in envelope. She said I'd know when to give it to you." My heart pounded. "You still have it?" "I do," he said. "Come by tomorrow." The next morning, I met him at his house, a small craftsman-style home filled with old wood furniture. He handed me a worn envelope sealed with wax. Across the front, in my mother's elegant handwriting, were the words, "For Amelia," when the numbers stop adding up. Inside was a USB drive and a folded note. "Trust your instincts. Truth is your inheritance." I ran my thumb over her handwriting, feeling the sting of tears. Henry leaned back in his chair, watching me. Whatever she put on that drive, he said quietly, it's what she didn't want your father or Caroline to touch. I nodded, gripping the envelope like it was a lifeline. When I got home, I set the drive on my desk and stared at it under the lamplight. It was small, silver, unassuming, yet it felt like a key. I didn't open it that night. Not yet, because part of me knew that once I did, there would be no going back. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the world outside, still dark and silent. Snow had started falling again. I made coffee, sat at my desk, and turned on my computer. The USB drive glinted beside the keyboard, waiting. I reached for it, took a deep breath, and whispered to the empty room. All right, Mom. Let's see what you've been hiding. Then I plugged it in. The moment the USB connected, the screen flickered and a single folder appeared. Margaret, private. My mother's handwriting had always been distinct, elegant, slanted slightly to the right, and seeing her name typed out like that made my throat tighten. I hesitated, staring at it, half afraid of what I'd find. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pulled me forward. Inside the folder were subfolders neatly labeled by year. The earliest dated back 15 years. I opened the most recent one, 2020. The first file was an email draft. The subject line read unauthorized transfers, confidential. My heart began to race. The email was addressed to my father. Richard, I've noticed discrepancies in the vendor payments and a series of transfers I can't explain. Caroline insists it's strategic reallocation, but the numbers don't align. Please review this before it escalates. The email was never sent. Below it was a saved draft of another. If anything happens to me, Amelia will know what to do. For a moment I just stared at the screen, frozen. My mother had known. She'd seen the corruption taking root even before she died. Caroline's manipulation hadn't started recently, it had been festering for years. I kept scrolling through the files. There were spreadsheets, audit logs, screenshots of internal communications. One email thread caught my attention. It was between Mom and one of the company accountants. He'd flagged repeated overpayments to a consulting firm that didn't appear on the company's approved vendor list. The accountant warned her that the issue might involve embezzlement. Mom had replied, I'll handle it internally. Keep this between us. The next message in the thread was from Caroline. Please disregard any concerns from accounting. I'm restructuring vendor relationships for efficiency. And that was it. The accountant never replied again. The deeper I went, the more tangled it became. Caroline had been rerouting money through shell companies for years. My mother had tracked it meticulously, quietly gathering evidence. But she never confronted Caroline publicly. Maybe she was waiting for the right time. Maybe she believed she could still save her. Tears blurred my vision as I scrolled through the last few files. In one audio recording, Mom's voice filled my small apartment. Weak, but steady. If you're listening to this, Amelia, it means I couldn't fix it in time. Don't let them twist what I built. Protect the truth even if it costs you. Her voice cracked near the end, and then the recording cut off. I sat there in silence, my hands shaking. It wasn't just a company anymore, it was her legacy. And Caroline had buried it beneath lies and greed. After an hour, I transferred every file to an encrypted drive, labeling it Backup Integrity. I stared at the folders glowing on my desktop, feeling like I was holding a bomb. The next morning, I woke to my phone vibrating on the nightstand. A video call from Caroline. Morning, sis, she said, her tone too cheerful. Her face filled the screen, perfect makeup, the background of her office shining with awards and polished wood. Dad says you've been reviewing old files. Feeling nostalgic, I kept my expression calm. Just some financial housekeeping, she smirked. You know, sometimes digging up the past only creates trouble. Be careful what you find, Amelia. Some things are better left buried. My pulse spiked, but I forced a smile. Don't worry. I always clean up after myself. Good, she said, her tone sharp beneath the sweetness. You wouldn't want to make Dad think you're causing problems again. She ended the call before I could reply. My reflection stared back at me from the dark phone screen, composed on the surface, but underneath the fear had teeth. An hour later, my work email pinged. An anonymous message. No sender, no subject, just one sentence. Stop before you regret it. I deleted it immediately, but couldn't shake the chill creeping down my spine. That afternoon, I met Uncle Henry at a small cafe near the river, the same one Mom used to take us to after school. The air smelled of roasted coffee and cinnamon, and for a fleeting second I almost felt safe. She knew I told him, pushing the USB drive across the table. She found the same things I did. He turned it over in his hand, nodding slowly. Your mother was always 2 steps ahead. She just hoped it wouldn't come to this. Why didn't she say anything, I asked. She could have stopped it. Henry sighed, his breath fogging the window. Because she loved your sister, and she believed your father would see reason if she gave him time. She didn't realize how deep Caroline's ambition went, or how blind your father could be. I leaned back, exhaustion washing over me. Caroline's not just ambitious, she's ruthless. She's been covering her tracks for years. Henry looked at me for a long time. Then you have to be smarter than she ever was. Don't let anger drive you. Let proof do it. He hesitated before adding, There's something else your mother mentioned before she passed. She called it the integrity clause. Said if the company ever fell into the wrong hands, you'd know what to do. The integrity clause, I repeated. It's in her will, he said, but your father never wanted to talk about it. She worked on it with a lawyer, Ethan Myers, I think. He handled all her private legal affairs. The name sparked recognition. Ethan Myers, Mom's old legal advisor. He'd attended the funeral, but disappeared afterward. Henry handed me a business card. He's still in Portland. I checked. Maybe he can help you understand what your mother planned. I slipped the card into my coat pocket, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. Thanks, Uncle Henry. He nodded. Be careful, Amelia. Caroline's not going to sit quietly if she suspects you're on to her. By the time I got home, dusk had settled over the city. The apartment was dim except for the soft glow of the desk lamp. I sat down at my computer to back up the files again. When I tried to log into the company server, a red message appeared: access denied. Account locked. My stomach dropped. I tried again. Same message. Then a new email notification popped up, this time from HR. Your system privileges have been revoked, effective immediately, pending review. Please contact your supervisor for clarification. There was no need for clarification. Caroline had struck. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. My heart was pounding, but underneath the fear, something colder began to form. This was no longer about survival, it was about strategy. She wanted to bury the truth. Fine. I'd learned to dig deeper. That night, I pulled out Ethan Myers' card and ran my thumb over the embossed letters. The hum of the city outside my window was faint, almost distant. I whispered into the quiet, Mom, I think it's time I met your lawyer. Somewhere inside, I could almost hear her voice again, steady, certain. Protect the truth even if it costs you. The lights in my apartment flickered once, then steadied. I reached over and turned off the computer, the USB drive still glowing faintly in the dark. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what Caroline could do. I was ready to find out what Mom had prepared for me. Ethan Myers looked exactly how I remembered him from my mother's funeral: sharp suit, silver hair, and eyes that missed nothing. His office smelled like old books and fresh paper lined with shelves full of legal binders. The kind of place where secrets didn't disappear, they were just organized. He shook my hand firmly. Amelia Bennett. I was wondering when you'd come. I hesitated, studying him. You knew I'd find you. He smiled faintly. Your mother made sure of it. He gestured for me to sit. She said one day when the numbers stopped adding up, you'd know it was time. I slid the USB drive across his desk. She left this for me. I think it's only part of what she was hiding. Ethan plugged it in without a word. The screen filled with files, and he scanned through them with a lawyer's efficiency eyes flicking line by line, pausing only when something caught his attention. Margaret was meticulous, he said finally. She documented everything. Transfers, shell companies, even conversations she had with your sister. She knew what Caroline was doing, I said quietly. She suspected, Ethan corrected, but Margaret was also protecting you. She wanted to give you leverage in case things ever went too far. He pulled a folder from his desk drawer, old and worn. This is the rest of what she prepared. The integrity clause your uncle mentioned. I leaned forward as he opened it. Inside were copies of legal documents and a handwritten letter. My mother's looping script filled the page. Amelia, if this reaches you, it means I'm no longer here to guide you. I've built protections into the company's foundation. In the event of fraud, manipulation, or unethical control, 30% of Bennett Interior shares will transfer to you. These shares carry voting rights that cannot be overridden even by majority control. Use them only when the company's integrity is at stake. I stared at the words, my chest tightening. She gave me control, conditional control, Ethan clarified. You can't sell those shares or profit from them, but you can use their voting power to block transactions, remove executives, or force audits. I ran my hand over the page. Does my father know? Ethan hesitated. He signed the amendment years ago, but I doubt he ever read it in full. Caroline certainly doesn't know. Your mother asked me to keep it confidential until you came forward. It was like the ground beneath me shifted. My mother hadn't just trusted me, she'd armed me. Ethan closed the folder and looked up. Amelia, I have to ask, are you ready for what this will cost you? If you invoke the clause, it will destroy what's left of your family's image. Caroline won't forgive it. Your father may never speak to you again. She already took everything from me, I said. What's left to lose? Ethan studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Then let's proceed carefully. You'll need irrefutable evidence before making a move. Once you confront them, you can't back down. That night, I sat in my car outside his office, long after the lights went out. Snow fell against the windshield, soft and soundless. I thought about Mom's words. Use them only when the company's integrity is at stake. It already was. The next morning, I walked into Bennett Interiors as if nothing had changed. Caroline's assistant looked up from her desk, startled. Miss Bennett, I thought you were on leave. I'm back, I said, smiling politely. Family business. I went straight to my office, my old office. The nameplate was gone, but the desk was still there. The drawers had been cleared out, my personal files replaced by stacks of glossy marketing mock-ups. Rebranding campaign, the label read. The designs were flashy, expensive, and soulless, cheap imitations of Mom's timeless aesthetic. Every page screamed Caroline. I took photos of the entire spread, then logged into the guest Wi-Fi using a portable drive Ethan had given me. It bypassed security firewalls, granting me access to internal archives. Within minutes, I was inside the company's main database. My fingers flew across the keyboard. The files came in fast expense reports, offshore transactions, email exchanges between Caroline and outside contractors. One email stopped me cold. Transfer $500,000 to Design Partners LLC by Friday. Label under brand development retainer. It was signed by Caroline and seed to my father. I downloaded everything to the drive. When I turned around, Caroline was standing in the doorway. You always did love working late, she said. Her voice was smooth, but her eyes were razor sharp. Funny how you can't let things go. I unplugged the drive discreetly. Some of us care about the details. She walked closer, her heels echoing in the silence. You're wasting your time. Whatever you think you're going to find, it's already been approved by Dad. By the board. You're the only one still clinging to the past. The past built this company, I said. Not your deals, not your branding. Mom's work did. Caroline's smile thinned. And look where it got her. I froze. She realized too late what she'd said, but she didn't take it back. That's what this is about, isn't it? I said. You've been trying to erase her. Don't make me the villain, Amelia, she snapped. You're just jealous that I finished what she started. I stepped closer until we were almost eye to eye. You didn't finish it, you corrupted it. Her expression hardened. You really shouldn't talk like that. Dad's already worried about your state of mind. Then tell him not to worry, I said, my voice steady. I'm just finally thinking clearly. She turned sharply, heading for the door. Don't test me, Amelia. I'm not playing anymore. I know, I said softly. Neither am I. The door slammed behind her. That night I couldn't sleep. I replayed her words over and over, hearing the crack in her composure. Beneath the arrogance, she was afraid. She knew something was coming. She just didn't know when. I opened my laptop and organized everything: Mom's files, the new evidence, the legal documents from Ethan. Each piece fit together like a puzzle: fraud, coercion, manipulation, theft. And at the center of it all, Caroline. At 2 a.m, I sent Ethan an encrypted email. I have what we need. What's the next step? He replied within minutes. We gather allies. You'll need board members who will stand with you when the time comes. There was only one person I could think of: Henry. The next day I drove to his house again. He greeted me with a worried smile. You look like your mother when she used to plan something big, he said. I need your help, I told him. And your vote. When I explained everything, the clause, the evidence, the plan, he listened quietly. Finally, he nodded. You're doing what your mother couldn't finish. Of course I'll stand with you. Relief washed through me, but it was fleeting. She warned me, Uncle Henry. She said it would cost everything. He smiled sadly. Truth always does, but it gives you something back too. Self-respect. As I left his house, snowflakes spun through the air, catching in my hair. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small or unheard. I felt unstoppable. The game Caroline started was about to end, and this time I was the one holding all the pieces. The office was silent when I walked in the next morning. Too silent. The kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. I could feel eyes on me as I passed through the hallway. Assistants, whispering glances, exchanged, the hum of gossip spreading faster than sound. Caroline's shadow loomed over every corner of this place now. I went straight to my desk, powered on my computer, and found my access fully restored. No explanation, no email, just a welcome screen as if the lockout had never happened. My stomach twisted. She wanted me to see this to know she was in control. My phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. We have a meeting at 2 p.m. Bring the documents, and be careful. At 1:55, I walked into his downtown office. Henry was already there, seated beside him. The three of us looked like conspirators in a corporate thriller. Ethan spread several folders across the table. We have everything we need to trigger the integrity clause, he said. The board meeting is scheduled for Christmas Eve. If you invoke it there, the transfer of power will be automatic, legal binding, and irreversible. I exhaled slowly, and Dad Ethan adjusted his glasses. He'll be shocked. But once he sees the evidence, he'll have to acknowledge it. Unless Caroline gets to him first, Henry added grimly. She already has, I said. She's been whispering in his ear for years. Ethan leaned forward. Then we make sure the truth speaks louder. He slid a USB drive toward me. This contains every piece of verified documentation. I've mirrored it across 3 secure servers. Even if Caroline tries to bury it, it's untouchable. I nodded, clutching the drive. When the time comes, I'll make sure the right people see it. After the meeting, I parked my car near the waterfront and sat for a while, staring at the river. My reflection shimmered on the glass. I didn't recognize the woman looking back, her jaw set, her eyes sharper than they used to be. Somewhere along the way, grief had hardened into resolve. That night, I worked from home. I opened Mom's old notes again, the ones labeled legacy. In between accounting formulas and supplier lists, she'd written small reminders in the margins, phrases that felt like breadcrumbs for me to follow. Integrity isn't inherited, it's proven. Family isn't who you protect, it's who protects you when you're not looking. Her handwriting was a comfort and a weight. I wondered if she'd known it would come to this, that one daughter would have to destroy another to save what she'd built. The next morning I arrived at the office early to prepare for the board presentation. Caroline was already there. Her reflection in the glass conference wall met mine like a mirror image gone wrong. She was smiling, of course she was. "Working late, showing up early," she said as I entered. "Still trying to prove something, just making sure everything's perfect for tomorrow." "Oh, I wouldn't worry," she said, leaning casually against the table. "Tomorrow's already handled." The way she said it sent a chill through me. She reached for a file and placed it in front of me. Dad's signing off on the expansion into Europe. Big move for Bennett Interiors. "You should be proud we're going global." I scanned the document. A $30 million investment deal with a foreign firm, terms vague, conditions predatory. "You're selling us out," I said quietly. Caroline shrugged. "It's called vision. Something you've never understood. You're laundering money through this deal." Her smile didn't fade. "Careful, Amelia. Words like that could get you sued." I stared at her, realizing she didn't even care about being caught anymore. She believed she was untouchable. That night I called Ethan. "She's planning a new deal bigger than anything before. It'll drain the company." He was silent for a moment. "Then we stop it before it's signed." "How use the clause early," he said. "Christmas Eve is symbolic, but nothing stops you from invoking it now." I hesitated. Mom wanted me to wait until it mattered most. "Amelia," he said gently, "it matters now." After hanging up, I walked to the window. The city was blanketed in snow, quiet and cold. I thought about my mother standing in her old workshop, sanding a table edge until it gleamed. She'd always said wood was honest. It showed every flaw, every imperfection, and you could either polish it or paint over it. Caroline had painted over everything. I was done polishing. The next morning I drove to my father's house. He was in his study, surrounded by paperwork and the faint smell of bourbon. He looked up, startled to see me. "Amelia," he said cautiously. "To what do I owe this visit? I need to talk to you about Caroline." He sighed. "Not this again. She's been stealing Dad. For years. I have proof." He set his glass down. "You've always been jealous of her success. This obsession is—" "It's not jealousy," I snapped. "It's theft. It's fraud. Mom knew about it. She tried to warn you." He froze at that, his expression hardening. "Your mother was sick. She wasn't thinking clearly." I pulled the folder from my bag and placed it on his desk. "Then maybe read this and see how clear she was." He hesitated, then flipped it open. Page after page of transactions, signatures, and evidence. I watched his face change from disbelief to confusion to something close to horror. "She documented all this," he murmured. "Yes, and now I have enough to take it to the board." He looked up sharply. "You'll destroy us." "No, Dad," I said quietly. "Caroline already did. I'm just stopping the bleeding." His hand trembled slightly as he closed the folder. "Leave it with me. I'll handle it." "That's what Mom said," I replied. And look what happened. I left before he could respond. Driving home, I felt both sick and steady. I had forced him to look at what he'd ignored for years. Whether he'd act on it or not didn't matter anymore. The truth was out. That night, I sent Ethan one final message: "Christmas Eve stays. We finish this together." He replied almost immediately. "Then it's settled. Prepare yourself." For the next week, I worked quietly, setting the stage. I compiled everything into one presentation: the stolen funds, the shell companies, the fake invoices, the legal clause. I rehearsed every word I would say when the time came. The last step was symbolic but necessary. I returned to Mom's old studio. Dust coated every surface, but her tools were still there. The chisels, the paintbrushes, the small wooden box with her initials carved on top. Inside was a single key attached to a note. "For the one who doesn't look away." The key fit perfectly into the drawer of her old drafting table. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, was a small flash drive labeled "Final Project." I plugged it into my laptop. A single file appeared: blueprint for the future. It wasn't a design, it was a letter. her voice written years ago. If you're reading this, Amelia, it means you've found your courage. Don't let them convince you that doing what's right makes you cruel. Remember, justice isn't vengeance. It's restoration. I sat there until the snow stopped falling, the weight of her words sinking in. Tomorrow I would walk into that boardroom with her voice in my head and her name on my side. Tomorrow the Bennett legacy would either die or finally be reborn. The city slept under a thin veil of snow, but I was wide awake. My mother's words kept looping through my head. Justice isn't vengeance, it's restoration. I sat at my desk, the glow of the laptop screen washing over the stacks of files, contracts, and evidence spread across the table like a battlefield map. Somewhere between exhaustion and resolve, I realized I was no longer reacting to Caroline. I was preparing to end this. At dawn, I called Ethan. "It's time," I said simply. He didn't ask what I meant. "Then let's do it right. You'll need allies." By noon, I was sitting in a quiet meeting room at Henry's law firm downtown. Ethan was there, calm as ever, sleeves rolled up, scanning documents with the focus of a surgeon. Henry sat across from him, glasses perched low, his expression lined with concern. Next to him was a young woman I didn't recognize, nervous, clutching a folder to her chest. "This is Sophie Turner," Ethan said. "She used to work in accounting under Caroline." Sophie offered a hesitant smile. I processed several of the vendor payments. Some of them didn't make sense, same routing number, different company names. When I asked questions, I was told to stay in my lane. Then my position was suddenly eliminated. I leaned forward. "You still have access to those transactions?" She nodded. "I made copies before they locked me out." I knew something wasn't right. She slid the folder across the table. Inside were spreadsheets, payment logs, and internal memos, all confirming what I'd already suspected. Ethan's voice broke the silence. "With this, the pattern is undeniable. Combined with the integrity clause, we have more than enough to trigger full oversight." Henry tapped his pen on the table. "So what's the plan, Amelia?" "Expose her in the middle of Christmas dinner." I looked up, meeting his eyes. "Exactly," he blinked, startled. "You're serious?" "She made that dinner her stage for humiliation. It's where she'll least expect me to fight back. I'll present everything in front of Dad, the board, and every person she's manipulated." Ethan gave a small nod of approval. "Then we'll need to prepare for every scenario. The evidence goes public only if they try to bury it. Until then, it's our leverage." We spent the next 3 hours crafting what Ethan called the contingency plan. Every file, every piece of data, every email Caroline ever sent related to the fraud would be compiled into one encrypted package. At exactly 7:00 p.m. on Christmas Day, an automated system would email that package to the company's board, auditors, and legal partners. "If you send this early," Ethan warned, "there's no undoing it. Caroline will be cornered." "You too." "I'm not backing out," I said. "Not after what she's done." When the meeting ended, I drove home through streets lined with twinkling lights. The world looked soft and peaceful, as if nothing ugly could survive under all that glitter. But beneath it, I could feel the current of tension, the calm, before something irreversible. That night, Ethan came over with his laptop. We sat in my kitchen, the hum of the heater and the smell of coffee filling the silence. He connected to the company's financial network through a back door he'd built years ago for Mom's estate. "Your mother was smarter than anyone gave her credit for," he said. "She left the access code under her own initials. Most people would have missed it." He typed a few lines of code, and suddenly the company's full archive opened on my screen. Line after line of numbers scrolled past payments, balances, transfers. It was dizzying. Then Ethan froze the screen. "There," he said, pointing to one entry. "A transfer scheduled for December 26th, $2 million, destination Grand Cayman." My stomach dropped. "Caroline's moving the money again." "Not if we freeze it first," Ethan said, fingers flying over the keyboard. "I'm setting up a temporary hold order under the integrity clause. She won't see it until it's too late." We worked through the night. I uploaded the final evidence into a secure folder labeled Christmas Dinner PDF. Ethan linked the autosend timer, testing it twice. At exactly 7:00 p.m. Christmas night, every truth I'd been guarding would be sent to those who could no longer ignore it. When the setup was complete, I leaned back, exhaustion crashing into me. Ethan closed his laptop and looked at me carefully. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "It doesn't feel good," I admitted. "It feels like pulling a trigger." He gave a faint smile. Justice often does. After he left, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window. Snow drifted past the streetlights, soft and relentless. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear faint Christmas music from another apartment. The normal world kept turning, unaware that mine was about to explode. I pulled out Mom's letter again and read the final line. "When the time comes, speak with grace, not anger." I practiced the words in my head. I didn't want to sound vindictive when the moment arrived. I wanted to sound like her, steady, sure, unshakable. Just past midnight, my phone buzzed. A blocked number. I hesitated before answering. Amelia Caroline's voice came through, smooth but sharp. "Still playing the victim, I see." I didn't reply. "I heard you've been meeting with lawyers," she continued. "Digging up old files. It's pathetic, really. You always mistake obsession for intelligence." "Go to bed, Caroline," I said, keeping my voice even. She laughed softly. "You really think you can beat me? You forget who holds the power in this family. Dad listens to me, not you. He'll listen when he sees what you've done." Her tone shifted lower, now venomous. "Careful, little sister. Truth cuts both ways." The line went dead. For a long time I sat in the dark, phone still in my hand, pulse thudding against my wrist. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to realize I wasn't backing down. I closed my laptop, double-checked the encryption, and whispered to myself, "Let her come." The next morning I woke before sunrise. The air felt heavy with the weight of what was coming. I dressed simply, black sweater, wool coat, no makeup. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized. Stronger, calmer. Before leaving the apartment, I slipped the small wooden key Mom had left me into my pocket. I didn't know why, but it felt like armor. By the time I reached the office, Caroline had already called an emergency staff meeting. She stood at the head of the conference table, radiant as ever, addressing the team about exciting global opportunities. I stayed at the back, silent, watching her perform. Every gesture, every smile was a lie so smooth it had become her truth. When the meeting ended, she caught sight of me. "Still hanging around," she said, tilting her head. "Just preparing for the holidays," I replied. "See you at dinner?" Her smile faltered for just a second. That evening, as I walked out of the building, I saw a dark SUV parked across the street. A figure sat behind the wheel, engine running, headlights dim. When I looked directly at it, the driver pulled away, slowly disappearing into the traffic. Someone was watching me. I locked my door twice that night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes following me, even as I poured another glass of wine and tried to focus on the ticking clock. At exactly 1:59 p.m. my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "All systems armed. Autosend verified. Merry Christmas, Amelia." I stared at the message, the clock rolling over to midnight. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow the lies would end. And when Caroline raised her glass at Christmas dinner, smiling that flawless smile, I'd finally have something stronger than fear. The truth. The snow outside my window looked like falling glass, beautiful, fragile, and deceptive. I sat with a cup of coffee, growing cold in my hands, watching the city wake up under the white hush of Christmas Eve. It was supposed to be a peaceful day, a day for family, forgiveness, and comfort. For me, it felt like the calm before a storm I had summoned myself. Every tick of the clock reminded me that I had 24 hours left before the truth went public. Ethan's words echoed in my head. "Once it's out, there's no taking it back." I didn't want to take it back, but I also couldn't shake the fear that this would destroy what was left of my family, the part of me that still wanted to believe in second chances. I glanced at my mother's photo on the shelf, her smile soft and unguarded. "You'd know what to say," I whispered. "You always did." My phone buzzed. Ethan. Final checks complete. The emails are queued. Timer set for 7 p.m. tomorrow. "Thank you," I texted back. "Whatever happens next, I'm ready." I wasn't sure that was true, but I had to believe it. By afternoon, I decided to visit my father. The Bennett estate stood quiet under a blanket of snow, the long driveway lined with frosted evergreens. Inside, the air smelled like cinnamon and polished Caroline's idea of Christmas perfection. I found Dad in his study, staring at a half-empty glass of bourbon. "Amelia," he said, startled when I entered. "You're here." "Just wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas," I said, sitting across from him. He studied me for a moment. "You look tired." "So do you." He sighed, glancing toward the window. "Your sister's been working non-stop preparing for tonight's dinner. She says it'll be good for the family." I bit back a bitter laugh. "I'm sure she does." He frowned. "You two need to stop this rivalry. Caroline has carried a lot of responsibility since your mother passed. She's not your enemy." I leaned forward. "Dad, do you really believe that?" He hesitated, looking down at his drink. "She's made mistakes, but mistakes," I interrupted softly. "Dad, she's been stealing from the company. She's selling our name to people who don't care about what Mom built." He rubbed his temple. "You're letting grief cloud your judgment again, Amelia." Grief. He always used that word like it was a disease. I stood, fighting to keep my voice calm. "You'll see the truth soon enough." He looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" I smiled faintly. "Just Merry Christmas, Dad." Outside, the cold hit harder than I expected. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, watching snow gather on the steps. Inside that house, love had become a language no one remembered how to speak. That evening, I met Ethan at a small coffee shop downtown. He was wearing his old wool coat, the one that made him look more like a professor than a lawyer. The lights around us glowed soft and amber, a strange contrast to the tension between us. "Everything's locked in," he said, sliding a laptop across the table. "You'll get a confirmation text when the emails go out. Once they're sent, Caroline can't stop them." I nodded, stirring my untouched coffee. "Do you ever think about what comes after?" Ethan leaned back. "After what?" "After the truth," I said. "After the damage. The company, Dad, Caroline, it'll all fall apart." He studied me quietly. "Sometimes things have to fall apart before they can be rebuilt." "That's what my mother said," I murmured. "But she didn't have to destroy her family to prove it." "Maybe she didn't," he said softly. "But you do." For a while, we just sat there, the silence heavy but oddly comforting. I realized how much I trusted him. How much I needed someone who wasn't bound by blood to remind me that this wasn't madness, it was justice. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. The snow had stopped, leaving the world outside still and white, untouched. I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my mother's last video, the one she'd recorded for me years ago. She sat in her studio, hair tied back, hands resting on a piece of unfinished wood. "If you're watching this," she said, "it means you've come to a crossroads. You'll be angry, and you'll want revenge. But revenge without integrity is just another form of betrayal." Her eyes softened. "Do what's right, even if it costs you peace." That's the kind of daughter I raised. The screen went black. I sat there long after the video ended, my eyes burning. "I hope I make you proud," I whispered. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. A blocked number. I froze. The message was short. "Stop the timer or the world learns your secret too." My blood ran cold. I typed back before I could think. "Who is this?" No reply. I looked out the window. Across the street, under a flickering street lamp, a car idled. The headlights turned off after a few seconds. Whoever was inside didn't move. I drew the curtains shut and double-checked the locks. Caroline. It had to be her. But what secret could she possibly mean? I'd already lost everything she could take. Sleep never came. I stayed awake till dawn, pacing the apartment, every sound magnified by my nerves. When the first hint of light broke over the horizon, I felt something shift inside me, fear giving way to clarity. I made a decision. I wasn't going to run. The next morning, I packed a small bag and left early for the estate. The city was still quiet, the roads slick with ice. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked composed, almost peaceful. Whatever Caroline thought she knew, whatever she was threatening, it didn't matter anymore. The house was already alive with preparations when I arrived. Staff moved between rooms carrying trays, flowers, and bottles of champagne. Caroline's voice floated through the halls, commanding cheerful fake. When she saw me, her smile tightened. "You came early," she said, surprised. "I wanted to help," I replied. "It's Christmas after all." Her eyes narrowed, searching for the angle. "That's thoughtful of you." I smiled back, matching her tone perfectly. Mom would have wanted it. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Guilt, maybe, or fear, but it vanished as quickly as it came. As I walked away, I caught my father's voice from the study, sharp and frustrated. "Caroline, what the hell is this about an offshore account?" Her response was muffled, quick, defensive. I paused in the hallway, heart pounding. The cracks were spreading faster than I imagined. I slipped upstairs to my old bedroom, pulled out my phone, and opened Ethan's message thread. All systems ready. Emails locked. Time left 24 hours. I stared at the countdown, the little blinking numbers, marking the end of years of silence. Outside, the snow had started again, slow, deliberate, and endless. Tomorrow night at 7 p.m., the truth would speak for itself. But tonight I had to play the part. I had to smile through dinner, raise my glass, and let Caroline believe she'd already won. Because the storm was coming. And this time it would carry my mother's name. The Bennett dining room glittered with gold and glass, every surface polished to perfection. The chandelier above the table cast a soft amber glow that made the silverware sparkle and the tension feel invisible. Caroline had thought of everything: handwritten name cards, imported wine, and a seating chart that placed me as far from her as possible. "Here's to family," she said, brightly standing with her champagne flute raised, "and to a year of success, innovation, and new leadership." I felt every eye shift toward me. She paused just long enough for the silence to cut. Then she smiled, tilting her head like she was about to deliver a punchline. "As of this week, I'll be assuming full control of Bennett Interiors. Effective immediately, Amelia will be stepping away from her duties to explore other opportunities." Applause. Real, actual applause. My father clapped first, his expression proud, relieved. The board members around him followed, unaware of what they were celebrating. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression calm. Caroline had staged this moment perfectly, just like I knew she would. I reached for my wine glass, swirling the crimson liquid slowly. "Congratulations," I said softly. "That's quite the announcement." "Thank you," she replied, voice honeyed. "You've worked hard, Amelia. We all appreciate your contributions." Her words tasted like poison, but I smiled anyway. "Before you get too comfortable with that promotion," I said, my tone, "even you might want to check your phone." Her smile faltered just slightly. "Excuse me," I gestured to the phone sitting beside her plate. "Go on, check it." The table went still. Even the children seemed to sense the shift in the air. Caroline gave a small, nervous laugh, reaching for her phone as if humoring me. She unlocked it, her polished nails tapping the screen. Then her face changed. The color drained from her cheeks. Dad frowned. "Caroline." She didn't answer. Her eyes darted across the table, wide and frantic. "What's going on?" he demanded. I set my glass down and folded my napkin neatly on the table. "It seems the board has just received a little Christmas gift. An automatic email with attachments labeled Evidence of Integrity Breach. I'm sure everyone's reading it right now." Gasps echoed around the room. A few phones buzzed, and the sound of incoming notifications filled the air like distant thunder. Caroline rose from her chair, shaking her head. "You didn't—" "Oh, I did," I said quietly. "Every transaction, every offshore transfer, every forged signature. It's all there. The room erupted in whispers. My father stood slowly, confusion giving way to anger. Amelia, what the hell is this? I turned to him. It's the truth, Dad. The one you refuse to see. He looked back at Caroline. Tell me this isn't real. Dad, it's nothing, just misinterpretations, she stammered. She's twisting everything. Ethan appeared in the doorway, calm, and composed, a folder in his hands. Actually, Mr. Bennett, it's all verified. I've personally authenticated every document. My father's voice cracked. Ethan, I represent Margaret Bennett's estate. Ethan interrupted, his tone measured. And I'm here to ensure her integrity clause is honored. The words hit the table like a hammer. What clause? Dad asked, his voice thin. I took a deep breath. Mom created a safeguard in her will, a legal clause that activates if the company ever falls into unethical control. It transfers temporary oversight to the shareholder with majority integrity rights. He blinked, trying to process. What are you saying? I'm saying that as of right now, those rights belong to me. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint clink of glass as Caroline's hand trembled against her champagne flute. You're bluffing, she hissed. Mom wouldn't do that. She trusted me. She trusted you to protect the company, I said softly. And you turned it into your personal bank account. Caroline slammed her glass down. You self-righteous little enough. Dad's voice boomed through the room, cutting her off. Both of you. But the damage was done. The board members, most of them longtime family friends, were already pulling up their emails, scrolling through pages of evidence. I saw their expressions shift from confusion to disgust to dawning realization. Ethan laid a printed packet in front of my father. All financial evidence, Mr. Bennett. Your daughter's been diverting funds for years. The Cayman accounts alone total more than $6 million. My father looked at Caroline, his face pale. Tell me this isn't true. She didn't speak. Caroline, her voice cracked. It's not what it looks like. They were just short-term reallocations. I was fixing the cash flow by forging my signature. His voice broke equal parts, fury and disbelief. Caroline's jaw trembled. She looked around for support, but no one met her eyes. Victoria, one of the board members, cleared her throat. Mr. Bennett, the email includes copies of the bank statements. There's no mistake. My father sank back into his chair, his age showing all at once. My God, he whispered. I felt something twist in my chest, not triumph, not satisfaction, just a hollow ache. Caroline turned to me, her voice shaking with rage. You think this makes you the hero? You've ruined this family. No, I said, my voice steady. I'm saving what's left of it. Dad's gaze lifted to me, eyes red-rimmed. Why didn't you come to me first? I said quietly. You never listened. For the first time, he didn't argue. Ethan cleared his throat gently. Mr. Bennett, as your late wife's legal representative, I advise you to formally acknowledge the integrity clause. If you don't, the courts will do it for you. My father nodded numbly, his hand shaking as he reached for the pen Ethan offered. He signed the confirmation page without another word. Caroline's face went white. Dad, no. You can't just hand her the company. I'm not handing her anything, he said. I'm doing what your mother would have done. The silence that followed was heavy, final. Caroline's eyes filled with tears, angry, desperate tears. You'll regret this, she spat. All of you. She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door. No one stopped her. The sound of her heels faded down the hallway, then vanished completely. My father sat there, staring at nothing. Your mother tried to warn me, he murmured. I didn't listen. I reached for his hand. She believed in you. She always did. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw understanding instead of disappointment. You're more like her than I ever realized, he said quietly. Ethan gathered the papers, sliding them into his briefcase. We'll schedule the official transfer in the morning. Tonight, take some time. When he left, the room felt impossibly large. The chandelier still glowed above us, its crystals catching the light, but the warmth was gone. Dad exhaled heavily. "She's my daughter," he said almost to himself. "So am I whispered. He closed his eyes and nodded. "Yes, you are." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and endless, blanketing the world in silence. I stood by the window watching it drift down over the estate my mother had built over the company she had trusted us to protect. The house looked peaceful again, but I knew better. Peace doesn't come after truth, it comes after the reckoning, and tonight the reckoning had finally arrived. The morning after Christmas was painfully quiet. The snow outside the Bennett estate had turned to slush, and the once perfect decorations now looked tired under the gray light. The dining table still bore traces of last night's chaos, a broken glass, a napkin stained with wine, and a silence that had settled deep into the walls. I sat by the window in my childhood room, a mug of coffee untouched in my hands. Downstairs I could hear faint movements, the housekeeper clearing dishes, my father pacing the study. The echoes felt distant, hollow. The night before had shattered the illusion of our family, and now we were just living among the pieces. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Ethan stepped in quietly, wearing the same coat from last night. "I didn't want to wake your father," he said. "How are you holding up?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine, just tired." He nodded. "You did the right thing, Amelia." "Funny," I said, staring out at the yard. "It doesn't feel like it." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "The board has already called. They want an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Caroline's been suspended from all company operations pending investigation." The words should have brought relief. Instead, they just deepened the ache in my chest. "And Dad?" Ethan hesitated. "He hasn't left his study since last night." He asked for the files. "I think he's trying to understand what went wrong." I swallowed hard. "He's trying to understand his daughter." "Both of them," Ethan said softly. He left after a few minutes, leaving behind the faint scent of winter air and paper. When the door closed, I sat in silence for a long time before heading downstairs. My father was exactly where Ethan said he'd be, sitting at his desk, papers spread out like an autopsy report. He didn't look up when I entered. "How long did you know?" he asked, voice low but steady. 6 months, I said quietly. "I found the first discrepancies in June." He nodded slowly. "Your mother found them years ago." I should have listened. I moved closer, noticing the deep lines on his face. He looked older, smaller somehow, as if the truth had carved away something essential. "She tried to protect all of us," I said. "You too." He gave a tired laugh. "She always did. Even from ourselves." For a while, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. "She loved this company," he said finally. "It was never just about money. It was her way of building something that would outlast her." I nodded. "And Caroline turned it into something else." He rubbed his temples. "She didn't start that way. You know that. Caroline always wanted approval, mine the public's. Somewhere along the line she confused power with worth." "She betrayed you," I said. "She betrayed herself." He looked up, then eyes meeting mine. "And what about you, Amelia? You exposed her. You saved the company. But what did it cost you?" I thought about the sleepless nights, the fear, the loneliness. The satisfaction of being right had faded, leaving only exhaustion. Maybe everything, I admitted. He studied me for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "I've been a fool," he said finally. "I thought control was the same as love. I pushed you away because you didn't need me the way she did." My throat tightened. "Dad," he held up a hand. "Let me finish. I owe you an apology. For doubting you. For failing your mother's legacy. For failing both of you." For a second I couldn't speak. Then I moved closer, placing a hand on his arm. "It's not too late to fix it." He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "Maybe not. But the fixing starts with you." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "The board's agreed that you'll serve as acting CEO while the investigation runs its course." The words hit me harder than I expected. I didn't ask for that, I know, he said, but you earned it, and the company needs someone it can trust. I sank into the chair across from him, stunned. What about you? I'm stepping back, he said. For good. I'll remain as an advisor, but Bennett Interiors needs new leadership. There was no pride in his voice, no trace of the old dominance, just acceptance. Caroline will fight this, I said. She already tried, he replied, sliding a folded letter across the desk. She sent an email early this morning. No apology, just excuses. She's leaving the country for a while. I stared at the letter, then pushed it aside. Let her run. The truth will follow her. He gave a small nod. And will you stay? I don't know yet, I said honestly. There's still a lot to fix. He leaned forward. Then start by fixing us. The words caught me off guard. I looked up and saw something in his expression I hadn't seen in years. Humility. Regret. Love in its rawest form. I managed a small smile. That's a tall order, Dad, he chuckled weakly. You're a Bennett. You'll manage. By the afternoon, the house began to feel less heavy. The staff moved quietly, cleaning up the remains of last night's disaster. I walked through each room, touching the furniture my mother designed, the spaces she had filled with light and warmth. Every piece seemed to whisper her name. In the dining room, I paused at the head of the table where she used to sit. I could almost hear her voice, calm and reassuring. You can't rebuild what you refuse to face. Outside, the snow had stopped, replaced by a soft drizzle that washed the frost from the windows. It felt like a small mercy. That evening, Ethan came by again with updates. The company's press statement goes out tomorrow morning, he said. We've framed it as a leadership transition and internal audit. Clean, professional, no scandals. Thank you, I said. He smiled faintly. You look lighter. I feel free, I admitted, but also guilty. Caroline was wrong, but she's still my sister. Ethan nodded. Guilt and justice often share the same space. You did what needed to be done, maybe, I said, but it doesn't make it easier. He hesitated, then placed something on the table, a small flash drive. Your mother's last files. The original drafts of her final designs. She wanted you to have them when the time was right. I took it carefully, my chest tightening. This was her real legacy, I whispered. Ethan smiled. Then keep building it. After he left, I sat by the window again, holding the drive between my fingers. The lights of the city shimmered in the distance, blurred by the rain. Somewhere inside, a fragile peace began to take root. Upstairs, I heard my father moving around, the sound of old floorboards creaking. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like the house was haunted. It felt alive again. I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. The battle was over. The war, maybe too. But healing would take time, and for the first time I was willing to give it. The fire in the study had burned low when I walked in. My father sat at his desk, staring at a pile of unsigned documents. His face looked older in the dim light, worn but softer somehow. The arrogance that once filled every corner of his presence had been replaced by something I didn't recognize: humility. You wanted to see me? I asked quietly. He nodded, gesturing to the chair across from him. Sit, Amelia. There's something we need to do. I sat, folding my hands in my lap. The silence stretched until it felt heavy enough to touch. Finally, he spoke. The board meets tomorrow morning to confirm your position as acting CEO. Before that happens, we're having a family meeting. Here. Tonight. My pulse quickened. Caroline won't come. She will, he said. She already agreed. A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. Out of guilt or strategy, maybe both, he admitted. But she's still my daughter and your sister. We're going to face this as a family, no matter how ugly it gets. For a moment I wanted to argue, but then I saw the weight in his eyes and realized he was done running. When Caroline arrived, she looked different. Her hair undone, makeup minimal, the sharp edges of her confidence dulled. She hesitated in the doorway, her voice barely a whisper. Dad. He gestured to the seat opposite mine. "Come in, Caroline." She sat glancing at me for just a second before looking away. The tension between us was almost physical, an invisible wire stretched to its breaking point. Dad cleared his throat. "I've spent the last 24 hours reviewing everything. The evidence your mother's files the clause. There's no denying what's been done, but I called you both here because I'm not interested in punishment. I'm interested in accountability," Caroline scoffed softly. "That's a pretty word for control." His gaze hardened. "It's a word for responsibility, something you've avoided for a long time." She looked down at her hands. "You don't understand. I didn't take that money for myself." I leaned forward. "Then where did it go?" Her voice cracked. "I was trying to cover debts. Expansion deals gone wrong. I thought if I could fix the numbers before anyone noticed, no one would ever have to know." "So you forged Dad's signature. You hid accounts offshore." Tears welled in her eyes. I panicked. Everything was slipping, and I couldn't admit I'd failed. For a long moment, no one said anything. The sound of the clock ticking on the mantel filled the space between us. Dad spoke first. "You could have come to me, to your sister. You chose deceit instead." Caroline's shoulders shook. "I didn't think you'd forgive me. You've never forgiven anyone." His expression softened, but his voice didn't. "Maybe that's true. But what you've done almost destroyed this family and your mother's legacy. There has to be restitution." "What happens now?" I asked. Ethan appeared at the doorway carrying a thin stack of papers. "If I may," he said, "these are the proposed terms your father and I discussed this afternoon." Caroline's head shot up. "Terms? You're negotiating my punishment. Your consequences," Dad corrected. "You'll repay every cent you diverted from the company, including interest. Your shares will be placed in a restricted trust, and you'll step down from your role indefinitely." Her eyes widened. "You're cutting me out completely. You're lucky we're not pressing charges," he said. "Amelia insisted we handle this privately." Caroline turned toward me, tears spilling freely now. Why would you protect me after everything?" I hesitated before answering. "Because I'm not like you, and because Mom wouldn't want us destroyed." Just changed. She let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. "You sound just like her." "That's the goal," I said quietly. Ethan laid the papers on the desk. "If both of you agree, I'll have the documents notarized tonight." Caroline signed first, her hand trembling. Dad followed, his expression unreadable. When the pen reached me, I paused. My name beside theirs on the page looked strange, like a new chapter written over an old scar. After Ethan left, the room felt smaller. My father poured 3 glasses of bourbon, handing one to Caroline and one to me. "To your mother," he said softly. "May she forgive us for taking so long to understand her." We drank in silence. Caroline set her glass down, eyes red but clear. "What about me?" she asked. "Am I supposed to just disappear?" Dad leaned back. "That's up to you. You can rebuild your life, or you can let guilt keep you small. But you won't be part of the company until you prove you can be trusted." She looked at me again. "And you? What do you want from me?" I thought for a long time before answering. "An apology. Not just to me, but to Mom. To yourself." Her lip trembled. "I don't know how to start." "Start by meaning it," I said. She nodded slowly, whispering, "I'm sorry." I believed her, maybe for the first time in years. When she left that night, she hugged Dad tightly, then hesitated before turning to me. "Merry Christmas, Amelia," she said. "Merry Christmas," I replied, and I meant it. After the door closed, Dad sat back down, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for decades. "You did good," he said. "Your mother would be proud." I smiled faintly. "You said that last night." He chuckled. "Then I'll keep saying it until it sinks in." The firelight flickered across the room, casting long shadows that felt softer now, almost familiar. "Tomorrow's meeting will be difficult," he said, setting his glass aside. "You'll be taking over a company in chaos." "I know," I said, "but we'll get through it. The truth's already cleaned most of the mess." He nodded. "And what about us?" I met his eyes. "We start over. No lies, no walls, just honesty." He gave a small, tired smile. That's harder than it sounds. I know, I said, but it's worth it. When I finally went upstairs, the house felt different. Lighter. The ghosts that used to haunt every hallway, the arguments, the resentment, the silence had quieted. Maybe they weren't gone, but they were at peace. In my old bedroom, I found a small wooden box on the dresser. My father must have placed it there. Inside was one of Mom's old design sketches, a table with 4 legs, each carved differently, but supporting the same surface. On the back she'd written in faded ink, "A family's strength is in balance, not perfection." I ran my fingers over the words and smiled. Downstairs I could hear the fire crackle again and my father humming softly to himself. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't sound broken. It sounded alive. A year later, I stood in the same office that used to be my father's sunlight, spilling through the wide glass windows onto the desk that once intimidated me. Now it was mine. The snow outside fell in soft, lazy spirals, blanketing the streets of Chicago in silence. Christmas lights blinked faintly in the reflection of the glass. I'd always thought the city felt lonely during the holidays, but this year it didn't. It felt peaceful. The company had changed since that night, since the truth cracked open the illusion of perfection. Bennett Interiors was smaller now, but cleaner, grounded in honesty instead of ambition. We lost a few major clients in the chaos, but we gained others who valued transparency over glamour. The employees seemed lighter, too. The office laughter didn't sound forced anymore. I'd learned to trade control for collaboration, to lead without fear. It wasn't easy, it wasn't glamorous, but it was real. My phone buzzed. It was Ethan. Board report finalized. Profits are steady and morale's higher than it's been in 5 years. You should be proud, Amelia. Thanks, I typed back. But it wasn't just me, he sent a single reply. You're starting to sound like your mother. I smiled at that. There was no greater compliment. I set the phone down and glanced at the framed photo on my desk. Mom standing in her workshop, hands covered in sawdust, her eyes bright with quiet determination. She'd built more than furniture. She'd built principles, values, a foundation strong enough to survive even us. The office door opened and my father stepped in. He looked healthier than I'd seen him in years, a new ease in his shoulders. You're still working? He asked, glancing at the stack of papers in front of me. Just finishing up before I head to dinner, I said. How's retirement treating you? He chuckled. Boring. I almost missed the chaos. I raised an eyebrow. Almost. He laughed softly and took a seat across from me. You've done good work, Amelia. Your mother would be proud. I know I am. Coming from you, that's saying something, I teased. He smiled, but there was warmth behind it now, not pride. I deserved that. We sat in silence for a while, both looking out the window at the snow. Any word from Caroline? I asked. She called last week, he said. She's running a small design studio in San Diego. Modest, but honest. She sounded lighter. That made me smile. She needed that. She said she might come home next month, he added. She wants to talk to you. I nodded. When she's ready, I'll be here. He studied me for a long moment. You really forgave her? I had to, I said. Forgiveness isn't for her, it's for us. For me. He nodded thoughtfully. Your mother would have liked that answer. When he left, I took one last look at the office before grabbing my coat. It no longer felt like a battlefield, it felt like a home. That evening, I hosted a small dinner at my apartment. No board members, no staff, no grand toasts, just family. Dad brought dessert, Ethan brought wine, and the table glowed with the gentle flicker of candlelight. We laughed about old stories, Mom's perfectionism, Dad's stubbornness, the time Caroline accidentally set the oven on fire one Thanksgiving. The laughter was soft but real, the kind that comes after years of silence finally broken. Halfway through dinner, Dad raised his glass. To second chances, he said. Ethan smiled. And to women who don't just survive the storm, they rebuild the house. I rolled my eyes but lifted my glass anyway. To peace, the sweetest kind of revenge. The clinking sound of our glasses echoed like music. After dinner, when everyone had gone, I sat alone by the window watching the city lights flicker against the falling snow. The world outside was quiet again, just like last year. But the silence meant something different now. It wasn't the calm before chaos, it was the calm after redemption. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver key my father had given me last Christmas, the one to Mom's old reading room. I'd worn it on a chain ever since, but tonight, something told me it was time to use it again. The drive to the estate was quiet. The house was dark, except for the soft glow from the porch light. I let myself in the air, filled with the faint smell of cedar and memory. Mom's reading room was just as she'd left it. Books lined neatly on the shelves, her sketches stacked on the desk, a vase of dried flowers still standing in the window. I unlocked the small cabinet by her chair, the one I'd never opened before. Inside was a folded letter addressed to me. My heart pounded as I unfolded it. My dearest Amelia, if you're reading this, you've already found your own strength. I always knew you would. Life will test you in ways I can't predict, but remember, this integrity will not protect you from pain, but it will protect your peace. Lead with kindness even when it's not returned. Forgive, but don't forget what you've learned. Love, Mom. Tears blurred the ink as I read it again and again. She had always known the path I would take even before I did. I sat there for a long time, surrounded by the quiet hum of her legacy. The fire in the small hearth had gone out years ago, but the room still felt warm. When I finally stood, I whispered into the silence, "We're okay now, Mom. You can rest." Back in the city, snow blanketed the streets, reflecting the soft light from shop windows and distant Christmas trees. I parked outside my apartment and took one last look at the letter before tucking it safely into my coat pocket. As I walked upstairs, I thought about everything that had happened. The lies, the betrayal, the reckoning, and the fragile grace that followed. I'd learned that revenge wasn't always about destruction. Sometimes it was about rebuilding better. About proving that truth can outlast deceit. Standing at the window, I watched the snow swirl beneath the streetlights and whispered the lesson I'd carried all year. Forgiveness doesn't erase justice, it completes it. Have you ever had to choose between family and doing what's right? Between peace and truth? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this journey of family betrayal and redemption spoke to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us that integrity, like love, is the inheritance that never runs out.